Alright, in this lecture, let's take a little bit of a more thorough look at how moves work. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to create a string and say string from, and we'll say takes, because we're going to take ownership away from the string through a function. So we're going to call this fn takes ownership, and we're going to take a string, and then in here we will just say let string equal s. Okay, so what's going to happen in this is, I guess I should call it, so takes ownership, and we pass in s. And then in here, you know what, we'll print it out, and we'll print out string. So what happens here? So we create a variable with a string takes, and then in here we give ownership to the function, right? So we're taking this variable, giving it ownership inside of this function, and we're using it in here. So if we cargo run it, we can see that we're in here inside this function. So just to make sure that the ownership was taken properly, let's actually, and to be lazy, I'm going to copy and paste. And it's not even going to let us build and run. But again, earlier on in this lecture, we saw these same errors where it talks about how we move the value and then we try to reference the value borrowed after the move. So, good. We can see that we pass ownership to functions when we pass the values through parameters. So, what about passing a value as a copy? So we'll say let value equals 1, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll just say, hey, how about make a copy of it? Okay, so then we'll call this 1, because that's what we're going to pass in, and we'll just make it of I32, and down here we'll say let val1 equals 1, and we'll print out val1. And then here we will say make copy of val. And we make a copy here because this is an I32 which implements the copy trait. So again, if we run it, we'll see 1 printed out, and the same concept applies what we learned last lecture of when it's a certain variable, some of them implement the copy trait. And I32 implements copy, therefore the function does not take the ownership of it. So we can also give ownership, so we'll say give ownership, and in here we'll do another string 1, string, and we want to pass it back a string, and then we will say given dot to string. Oh, got an error. What do we got? We'll see. So up here we will have let type string equals give ownership. Oh, and we don't want to pass a parameter, and I see what my issue is down below. Get rid of that. Okay, so we called give ownership, which owns given It owns this, even though it's not technically a parameter, it still owns the value. And we can print it out and show that we now have ownership of it. So, and it was given. So down here, we passed ownership back up through a returning of a string. So now we can also do both of them. So we can take and give. So let's do another string. Call it string 2 of string, and it's going to return a string, and we'll just do that. We'll return exactly what is given back. So we'll say let string 3 type string equals take and give, but of string 1. So now I expect string 1 to print out given, which it does. And to prove that we took it, let's try printing out string 1 and see what happens. So we already got our error, which is a good sign. So we can see that we are able to take and give ownership through functions. Well, what about with control flow statements? Do they work the same? So let's take a look at that just to see what is going to happen with those. So we'll again keep super simple concepts here, and we'll say let string 4 equals string 3 else, and this will obviously never get run because we have true in the block above, but just for sake of it, string 5 also equals string 3. Okay. So what happens if we try to print out string 3? Well, it's giving us that error. Sounds like a good sign. Okay, let's see what it says. Move occurs because string 3 is type string, does not implement copy. That checks out. At line 35, the value is moved here. So also in control flow statements, ownership operates the same as if they're not there. So you can pass ownership through those as well. And lastly, let's look at a loop. So for this, let's just do a kind of a clean slate. Let's comment all this out. We'll comment all this out to suppress any errors or warnings, I should say. So let's create a mutable string 2. And then let's just call loop. And I actually want to, we will give let mut str1 equal string from Tyler. Okay. So a loop. Remember, this is just going to be an infinite loop that happens nonstop. So let's assign str2 to str1. And what do we get? So we also have an ownership issue here. And this is actually really important to note because remember, this is an infinite loop. But imagine if you have a for loop or a while loop, based on some kind of condition. Well, if you change ownership of a variable or a value, I should say, inside a loop, that ownership changes. So that ownership needs to be able to stay alive on that value for the entirety of the loop. Because if you change ownership, you might break the loop, which is what happens in this case, because it says here the value was moved here in previous iteration of a loop. So those are just a couple of more examples of how ownership works. And I did not want to spend as much time typing out the codes as going over the concept, so that was why it was a lot of copying and pasting. But all of these concepts we will practice a lot throughout this course, so I really just wanted to make sure I introduced them just to really emphasize how important these concepts are for understanding the Rust language.